Hello Year 9 and welcome to your next poetry PowerPoint. Before we start, can you please make sure you've got all your materials ready? That includes a pen, paper or the remote learning booklet either on the screen or a printed copy. Thank you, and then when you're ready, move on to the next slide. Right, let's now go through a quick do now quiz to check your general understanding of poetry. So there's a few questions, some will be easier than others, but I'd like you to have a go and spend a few minutes on these, and then we'll go through the answers on the next slide. Right, let's go through the answers then. Okay, so for the first one, a simile, I'm sure you found this super easy because you've been doing this one since primary school. This is when you compare two things using like or as. So he ran like the wind. But I'm sure you can come up with better similes than that. The second one was all to do with structural features. Now, you might know that we don't call them paragraphs in poetry, we call them stanzas. You probably remembered about rhythm and rhyme, which we'll go through in more detail as you study the poems anyway. There's a few here that you might not have heard of or you might remember them, and these are enjambment, end stop lines and caesura. Enjambment is when you do not have punctuation and the lines running to each other. End stop lines when there is a bit of a punctuation because the poet does want you to stop and pause. And caesura, this is when you have punctuation in the middle of a line. Number 3 then, theme. So it's a very general, an overall topic or an idea that a poet has, and it will be something that features very heavily. So if the poem's about love, the poem will be about love throughout, and that is the theme, that's the main topic, and it will reoccur as you read it. Number 4, so hopefully you did a little bit of breaking down the words here. So the first one we'll look at is monologue. So the word mono, you might know, means one. Log is to do with talking, such as dialogue. And the word dramatic, which you might remember from drama, okay, is to do with somebody speaking on stage or in a performance. So if you did break up the words, well done. The definition then has been written down for you, and this is usually when one person will deliver a speech in a play, or as we're doing in poetry, and you learn things about them, you learn things internally about that character. And the fifth one, which was a little bit more difficult, is allusions. Now, sometimes people will refer to things that have happened in the past or other texts purposefully to make links to the past. So a lot of the times when we read something, we might actually see links to biblical allusions. So if there's a mention of a snake, a lot of people will often link that to the serpent, to Satan, okay, who's in the Bible. So these are allusions, and you will find these in all sorts of literature, but you will see it in poetry as well. Okay, now that we've gone through that, we go to the next slide, please. So the poem that we'll be studying today is my favourite poem of the collection, Ozymandias. And although it's one of the shortest poems in the anthology, it's actually got a lot of content because the language is so rich in it. Now, it was written by Percy Shelley. Now, you might be looking at that surname thinking, oh, that sounds a bit familiar. Well, that's because his wife was somebody very famous as well, Mary Shelley, who wrote a very iconic book called Frankenstein, which I'm sure you've all heard of, and I bet some of you might have read it as well. So this poem is going to be the focus of our attention today, and there'll be lots and lots to say about it, which you'll find out shortly. So if you move on to the next slide, we can make predictions about the title first of all. Right, so the next task for us is to make predictions, and we're making predictions based on the title. Now, you've been given quite a few hints here because of the word. It's been broken down for you, so that should help you answer the questions on the slide. So read through them, answer the questions, spend no more than 5 minutes, and then when you're ready, move on to the next slide and we'll go through some of your ideas. Okay, so as you can see, the word Aussie means something that's able to breathe or air, and something that's related to mandis or mandates. If you've ever heard of the phrase court mandated, that means that you have to do that, so it's a rule. So if you look at those two words together and try to come up with a translation, hopefully you should have come up with something which suggests that somebody who can rule possibly controls the air that you breathe or where you are. And that should give you a few hints as to what kind of a person or ruler this person might be for question 2. Now, number 3 is very important because this tells you a little bit about context here. So, if he was more interested in the simple lives of the common people, do you think that he's presenting ideas? Do you think he will be presenting ideas about somebody who is a good ruler or somebody who is more of a dictator, somebody who controlled their people? So something to think about, and this is all just from the name of the poem, and the name has got so many different interpretations, but for you, you should be thinking along these lines because this is for you. This could be a quotation that you could use when analysing the poem. Now, we will go over this in more detail as we go through the slides, but something to remember, those of you really trying to push yourself, in Latin the name means so goes glory. Now this is very ironic, and I want you to think about that, and we'll discuss why you might think it might be ironic as we go through the PowerPoint. Okay, now go to the next slide. Okay, I'd like you to spend about 5 minutes on this task. All you need to do is read the information on the slide or in your booklet and summarize the information as briefly as you can in 4 bullet points. And one of the reasons for this task is sometimes when you take information and interpret it as your own, it makes it easier for you to remember. So this is a really good tool for that, and it will help you to understand a little bit more about the poet. Okay, so now it's time to read my favourite poem, Ozymandias, and you can either read it first of all on the slide or in your booklet, obviously, and then you can watch an animation, a really clever animation of the video with a reading of it as well. But come back to this poem as well, because it's always easier to read it yourself, to really digest what's happening in the poem, and that will help your understanding, especially when we move on to the analysis task in a few moments. Now, I'd like you to summarise the poem in your own words using the 3 questions on the slide or in your booklet. This is just to help you consolidate your understanding of it, and it shouldn't take you more than 5 minutes really, because it's just your initial thoughts, and then we'll go through the some of the themes, some of the ideas on the next slide. Okay, so now that you've read the poem and some contextual information, let's go through it just to make sure that your understanding of it is embedded and that you do understand what the poem's about. Okay, so you learnt that Ozymandias, the poem, has been inspired by an Egyptian pharaoh, and this was important because Shelley wanted to write about people who, such as leaders and monarchs and governments, who probably too powerful, and it was a criticism of what they were like. and that's why he chose to base it on this pharaoh. And it's again really clever poem because it tells you, it reveals a lot of information about what this person was like just based on the statue's features. So I'll go through it in a little bit more detail, and then I'll go over the form, and we'll come back to that word irony that we discussed at the start as well. Okay, so it's all about the ruins of a statue, Ozymandias, okay, based on this Egyptian pharaoh. And the narrator of the poem says he met a traveller from an ancient land and then tells us the tale of the traveller. Now, there's two different voices, but then you've also got the third voice of Ozymandias when you read the inscription as well. The man has seen the remnants of a huge statue, okay, in the desert. Um, there were two gigantic legs, but without a trunk next to them, and it just shows us that the fact that somebody has had this massive statue built for them, but at the end of the day, it's nothing but shattered remains, because it's powerless against nature and time, and there's really nothing you can do about it. Okay. And the other thing that you might have learnt from it as well is obviously the inscription, and that would have been from the from Ozymandias, and it just shows how self-important he believed himself to be, and his arrogance. But in the end, all of this is just temporary, okay, and that's what Shelley would have wanted to show as well. The second thing that I wanted to go through is the structure of the poem, or the form, specifically. Now, you might think it's a very short poem, but there's a reason for this, because it's called a sonnet. Now, you might have heard of a sonnet, you might have studied some sonnets as well, or you might have read some, and this is just a typical type of poem. It became very popular during the Italian Renaissance, and it's based on love most of the time. That's one of the main themes for writing a sonnet. Your teacher will go into more detail about this, but one of the reasons why Shelley might have chosen to write this in the form of a sonnet is because it's a poem about self-love. So Ozymandias had a lot of self-love about himself. So that's another reason why he might have chosen this structure. And finally, we talked about this poem being ironic. And the reason that it's ironic is because although the ruler was arrogant, there's now nothing left of him, and it just symbolises the temporary nature of human power in comparison to nature and time, as mentioned earlier. Okay, so now let's move on to the next slide, and we can go into a little bit more detail on the poem and the language. So for this task, I'd like you to have a look at some of the vocab used in the poem. So these are just some of the words that might have stood out to you, and they're all on the left hand side. Some of them you'll know, some of them you might need to research a little bit more to help you with the definition. But once you've done that, have a read of the word in context where it sits in the poem, and then start thinking about what this line might suggest, what it might mean. And if you need to, go back to the poem and have a look at it in context again. Have a listen to, or have a read of what we talked about in the last slide about what the poem's about, and then start thinking about your interpretations and start writing them on the right hand side. And then for this task, if you need to, you can spend about 20 minutes on it, just because you might need to go back to the poem to help you. And then once you're ready, move on to the next slide. So this slide just goes through the answers. So check through your answers
So for this task,
alongside
I've broken down the poem
alongside this
in about
slide. And if you
3
need to make
different
any
slides
corrections, do
and
so
all the
now,
questions
please,
in the
and then
booklet
move
as
on to the
well.
next slide when
What I'd
you're
like you
ready.
to do is to go through the poems and go through the questions alongside it and start thinking about what you think this poem might suggest. Um, think about the connotations of some of the words used and your interpretation of it as well. And then once you've finished that, you can go through some of the answers a few slides down.
Okay, so vocabulary is really important, and one of the things that you'll learn alongside the poems are keywords to help you analyze the poems. Now, the keyword for this poem is ephemeral, and I'd like you to use this word when you analyze the poem, but to help you understand it, I'd like you to complete the tasks on the slide, and this will just consolidate your understanding in your mind, and you can use this word when analysing the poem or even about other poems or other texts as well. And this is just a really good task just to help you boost up your vocabulary skills um, for for the exam and for your any other lessons as well.
So this is a quick 5-minute activity. I'd just like you to find me the line that shows some of these statements. Okay, so the first example has been done for you. So all you need to do is find me the line in the poem that matches these statements. I'd like you to have a think about some of the big ideas in this poem. So looking at this checklist, which themes do you think fit in with this poem? Okay, once you've done that, you can move on to the next slide and we'll go through the answers.
Okay, so themes, big ideas, reoccurring ideas, which hopefully you remember from the Do Now activity. So the three themes that I've ticked are the main themes for this poem. So Ozymandias is about the power of humans, but it could also be about the lack of power, because in the end he is just a shattered visage in the desert. So it could go either way, but you'll go into this in more detail with your teacher when you do start comparing the poems later on. The next theme that I've ticked is the power of nature. Regardless of what Ozymandias thinks, it's nature that wins, because it's nature that's now led to his crumbling mess, really, which is why that one is a key theme for this poem as well. And the final one that I've ticked is negative emotions, and that's to do with pride or too much pride in the case of Ozymandias. And I'm hoping that you picked that one because you would have noticed his hubris, the fact that he thinks a lot of himself. Okay, and next slide, please. So, this is the final task, unless you are reaching for the 7 to 9 grades. And in that case, can you please refer to your booklet, because there's an extra activity, and anyone can do this actually, because it's there just to push yourself. And it's a teacher, Mr. Salis, and he's going over Ozymandias in a little bit more detail, and there's a few boxes for you to fill in the work booklet. Once you've done that, can you come back to this? Okay, so this is the final task now for you, and it's the essay question. So I'd like you to write 2 paragraphs based on this question. How does Percy Shelley present Ozymandias as a cruel ruler? Okay, and this is the main structure of a paragraph. So you should always try and have a clear point at the beginning of each paragraph. So this is your topic sentence. So this is what your paragraph is going to be about. Next, you should also have quotations and single word analysis about the quotations and language that you choose. And then finally, you should try and include some some information about the author. What are they trying to warn us about or reveal, or what are they teaching us? And this is important because it shows that you've got a contextual background into your understanding of the poem too. So let's go through this model answer and see if it's got all of the three points required for a paragraph. So Shelley presents Ozymandias as a tyrant, someone who rules through fear by emphasizing how cruel and merciless he is. When Shelley describes the statue, he details the wrinkled lip and the sneer of cold command. So in that first two sentences, it's got a clear point that Ozymandias is a tyrant, and I've got a quotation that matches with that. I'm going to carry on now. So perhaps Shelley uses the adjective cold to reveal that this ruler had a frozen heart who punished his people needlessly, almost as if he enjoyed wielding his power over others. The fact that he has a wrinkled lip that has a sneer reinforces that he is displeased with his subjects and signifies his extreme arrogance as a king. The poem is based on Ramesses II, who was one of the ancient world's most powerful rulers. He reigned as pharaoh for 66 years, and he led the Egyptians to numerous military victories, built massive monuments and temples, and accumulated huge stores of wealth. He eventually became known as Ramesses the Great and was revered for centuries after his death. But the fact that he is depicted in this light suggests that Shelley could be criticising his reign, and the sculpture could be subtly revealing that he was not as loved or as truly revered as he thought. Okay, so there's analysis of the quotation. I keep linking back to the quotations I've used as well, and then finally I've included a little bit of information about the context as well. And this just shows that you understand why Shelley might have written this poem and why he might be criticising it in this case. So this one will be easier to talk about context than some other poems because there is a lot of information um, about the context for this poem. And once you've had a go at doing your own two paragraphs, okay, you can send in your work to your teacher who will have a look at it for you. Okay, and that's it from me. Thank you and good luck.